Welcome to the Economist in Your Ear podcast. Today we're unpacking a truly pivotal moment, one that sent, well, shockwaves across the globe. The U.S. strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. The Economist offered a compelling, immediate assessment, and our mission today is really to go beyond those initial headlines. We're going to dissect its core arguments, sure, but then using additional context, some critical analysis, we want to challenge its assumptions, explore what might have been overlooked, and consider the much broader implications. You're here for those aha moments, right? And we're aiming to give you a truly informed, kind of multi-layered perspective. So let's set the scene with what The Economist initially reported. The pre-dawn June 22nd strike. This was no small operation. We're talking about 6 American B-2 bombers dropping multiple GBU-57 weapons. Those are the MOPs, massive ordnance penetrators, specifically designed to destroy deeply buried targets like Fordo.
Right, Fordo being that critical facility built deep inside a mountain, supposedly for protection.
Exactly. And simultaneously, you had cruise missiles hitting 2 other key sites, Natanz, the main enrichment facility, and Isfahan, crucial for processing uranium before enrichment. And immediately after, President Trump made that very bold declaration, didn't he? Saying Iran's program was completely and totally obliterated.
He did, a very strong claim.
And The Economist's initial framing then sketched out 3 potential paths forward for Iran. First, maybe symbolic retaliation, then diplomacy. Second, Iran lashes out, maybe dragging Washington into a wider conflict. Or third, and this is the big one, Tehran quits the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, and tries to rebuild secretly.
It's quite striking, isn't it, how quickly that narrative, that word obliteration, really took hold in the immediate aftermath. But, if we connect this to the broader strategic picture, a closer look, a more critical assessment reveals a far more complex reality than that initial framing might suggest. The shockwave was real, absolutely captured global attention, but the true impact, that requires digging into the details.
You've hit on something crucial there. So when we drill down into those specifics, did these massive bombs actually obliterate Iran's capabilities? Or was the impact, well, much more nuanced? We're dealing with incredibly complex, deeply buried facilities here, designed to withstand exactly this kind of thing.
And that raises the vital question, exactly how much time or, strategic advantage did these bombs really buy? Let's take Fordo first. Its resilience. While those Maxar satellite images clearly showed, I think it was at least 6 fresh craters on the mountain above the facility.
Yes, I saw those images. Pretty dramatic.
They were, but analysts openly conceded they cannot confirm interior collapse of the actual enrichment hull. Remember, this hull is buried roughly 80 meters below solid rock. That's incredibly deep.
80 meters, wow.
So while the immense shockwave could certainly scramble the delicate centrifuges inside, make them useless in the short term, a total cave-in, the obliteration claimed that seems far less plausible.
Okay, so Fordo damaged, maybe severely, but not necessarily collapsed into rubble. What about the nuclear material itself? The HEU?
Right, the highly enriched uranium stockpile. U.S. cruise missiles did target tunnels at Isfahan, where Iran reportedly kept much of its 60% HEU material. And that 60% material is a crucial step towards weapons-grade uranium.
Very close, so.
But, and this is important, Iran had hinted before the strike that some of this material had already been moved, relocated.
Ah, so not all of it might have been there.
Exactly. It's a critical detail because even if, let's say, only 20 to 30 kilograms of that HEU survived the strikes, Iran still retains several weapons worth of feedstock, the raw material, once facilities are potentially rebuilt.
That distinction is incredibly important. It implies that even a small amount surviving means the core problem hasn't vanished. It's just changed shape, maybe. And what about Iran's ability to simply re-enrich elsewhere or just rebuild what was damaged? Is that also part of this more complex picture?
Absolutely. You have to consider their reconstitution capacity. The IAEA's 2024 report noted approximately 1,000 IR-6 centrifuges. Those are the more advanced, faster models still stored at Natanz. And then there's an undisclosed number reportedly moved to this new site, Safiabad.
A new site, so dispersal was already happening.
It seems so, and crucially, shattered cascades those networks of centrifuges, they can be replaced. If Iran keeps the know-how, keeps its inventory of parts, it could reestablish production in perhaps 12 to 18 months, maybe sooner, maybe later, but feasible.
12 to 18 months, okay.
So the bottom line here seems pretty clear. The strike likely imposed a temporal setback. We're talking months, perhaps a year. Not the obliteration President Trump claimed. It got time, yes. But it certainly didn't eliminate the underlying capability or, critically, the knowledge.
Right. It created a window, maybe for diplomacy, maybe for something else entirely.
Precisely. It could be leveraged for intense diplomatic overtures, or conversely, it might become a period where other regional actors feel compelled to make their own moves, knowing the threat isn't gone, just delayed.
So the physical damage was real, significant even, but clearly not obliteration. What about the political fallout then? The economists outlined those three scenarios for Iran's response. Looking back, how well did those hold up, and what complications might have been missed? Because, as we know, international relations rarely follow a neat flowchart.
Exactly right. Let's dig into what was perhaps overlooked in those initial paths. Consider the first one. Iran opts for a symbolic response, then diplomacy. Plausible on the surface, sure, but this might not have fully accounted for the complexities of U.S. domestic politics.
Oh, so?
Well, reports indicated, 60% of American voters oppose deeper involvement in a conflict with Iran. That's significant pushback. Plus, you have Congress potentially invoking war powers within 60 days of the strike. That could seriously limit President Trump's leverage for any kind of swift diplomatic resolution he might want.
A domestic constraint. Okay. And what about that second scenario, the cycle of direct retaliation? Iran often surprises with its asymmetric playbook, doesn't it?
They absolutely do. The article highlighted the risk of direct retaliation, but Iran's history, their playbook, is often far more asymmetric, harder to pin down.
Like using proxies.
Exactly. Think about militia rocket fire on, say, Bahrain or Kuwait. That tests the U.S. without clear Iranian fingerprints. Or consider the Houthis in Yemen. They could easily resume Red Sea shipping attacks at almost zero cost to Iran directly, severely complicating any clear proportional U.S. response. Makes it harder to de-escalate cleanly.
Right. Plausible deniability and asymmetric costs.
Yeah.
That makes deterrence really tricky.
It does. It muddies the water significantly.
And the most serious scenario, Iran quitting the NPT, making a covert dash for a weapon. That's the nightmare scenario, really. But when we think about such a drastic move, are there external pressures or actors that might make that path more complicated than it looks?
This is where a crucial external actor, China, often gets maybe not overlooked, but underweighted in these immediate crisis assessments.
China. How do they fit in?
Well, China is Tehran's #1 customer for crude oil. That's huge economic leverage. And its state media already signaled, quite clearly actually, that Beijing would need to reevaluate those energy ties if Iran were to leave the NPT.
So economic pressure from their biggest customer.
Significant economic pressure. It indicates leverage that deserves far more consideration. China's own interests might make that dash scenario far less straightforward or sustainable for Tehran than it might appear on paper.
Okay, that's a really important point about external factors. Now, shifting gears slightly, it's easy to focus on events and reactions, but often it's the unstated assumptions behind a strategy that really matter in the long run. What core beliefs about Iran's program, or maybe its leadership, might need a closer look here?
That's a vital question. It gets to the fundamental strategic assumptions underpinning these kinds of military actions. One is treating Fordo as a kind of single point of failure.
Which it clearly isn't if they were already dispersing centrifuges.
Precisely. While Fordo is undeniably critical, Iran apparently began dispersing centrifuge rotors, bellows, key components after Israel's June 13th raids, even before this big U.S. strike. This suggests a shift towards a more network enrichment model. Multiple smaller hauls may be hidden better.
Making it much harder to decapitate the program in one go.
Inherently harder. It moves away from a surgical strike fantasy towards a far more complex, maybe endless game of whack-a-mole. You can't preempt it with a single overwhelming strike anymore.
Okay, so the program itself is maybe more resilient, more networked than assumed. What about the assumption about the regime itself? That it can simply be deterred by overwhelming force? Surely a strike this big must have some lasting deterrent effect.
Well, that's another critical assumption worth questioning. Regime deterrability. The idea that massive force will simply make them back down might be incomplete. Supreme Leader Khamenei's calculus mixes regime survival, yes, but also revolutionary legitimacy. For them, absorbing damage, taking a hit but then standing firm, that can actually boost domestic resilience and their own legitimacy.
So it could almost backfire, in a way. Reinforce their narrative.
It potentially could. We saw polls within Iran showing a rally effect after the Soleimani strike in 2020. They might frame enduring this kind of aggression not as weakness, but as steadfastness, reinforcing their resolve rather than breaking it.
That's counterintuitive, but makes sense from their perspective. And then there's this strategic idea, escalate to de-escalate. It's a favored tactic for some powers, but does it really work on Tehran?
Its effectiveness on Iran is, well, certainly debatable. Remember, 2020, after the Soleimani hit, Iran didn't launch an all-out war. They answered with a very calculated, calibrated missile barrage on an Iraqi base housing U.S. troops.
Right, signaling capability without going over the edge.
Exactly. But today, after losing key facilities in this strike, their leadership might feel that further restraint actually looks like weakness. It could undermine their credibility, maybe domestically or with their regional allies.
So the calculation might be different this time.
It could lead to a very different calculus, yes, where not escalating beyond a certain symbolic point is seen as more damaging than taking a bigger risk. It's unpredictable.
Okay, so we've questioned the scenarios, the assumptions.
Yeah.
But beyond the immediate military and political chess moves, there are always those external factors, the wild cards, that can just completely change the game. What were some of those that maybe weren't fully explored in the initial reporting? Because the world doesn't operate in a vacuum, right?
Absolutely not. And it's truly eye-opening how many critical elements can influence the outcome, elements that might not be immediately obvious in the fog of the event itself. These are the secondary, tertiary ripple effects that often get lost initially, but can prove just as impactful, maybe more so down the line.
Like what, for example?
One major one, the oil price shock. Brent crude spiked, 18% within hours of the strike? That's huge.
18%. Wow.
And if you see a sustained, say, 15-20 rise in oil prices, that could shave maybe 0.3 percentage points off global GDP. And critically, it could reignite U.S. inflation.
Which would be politically toxic.
Extremely toxic, especially heading into mid-2026. So this isn't just geopolitics. It hits global economics, hits everyone's wallet.
That's a massive economic ripple.
Right.
What about regional politics? Israel, for instance.
Israeli domestic politics is another significant wild card. Prime Minister Netanyahu might have gotten an initial polling bump from the conflict, sure, but that could evaporate pretty quickly if Iran's proxy war drags on, creating prolonged instability. This could potentially trigger a snap Knesset vote in early election.
Which could change everything for their strategy.
Completely upend his government's war timetable, their whole approach. The political clock ticks differently there, and it's unstable.
And are there any sort of hidden diplomatic efforts, back channels that might be surprisingly influential?
Absolutely. Look at the Gulf states. They provide a crucial, often unseen variable. The UAE and Qatar, for example, apparently opened back-channel shuttle diplomacy within hours.
Really? Within hours? Why so fast?
Because they're acutely aware of the economic fallout. They fear a massive exodus of tourism and finance from the region if the conflict escalates. It hits their core economic models.
So self-interest driving diplomacy?
Exactly. It indicates that a ceasefire framework might actually emerge without direct U.S. blessing. It highlights these alternative diplomatic avenues driven by a deep regional desire for stability, or at least predictability.
Okay, so factoring in all these nuances, the real impact versus the claims, the overlooked complications, the questionable assumptions, these surprising wild cards, what might a more balanced, kind of multi-layered forecast look like? It's clear this isn't a simple case closed. It's an ongoing, evolving challenge.
Right. If we try to connect all these pieces, integrate them, here's maybe a more plausible view of likely developments. Short term, say the next 7 days. Expect Iran to launch some limited drone and missile strikes, probably targeting U.S. bases in Iraq. Symbolic, but sends a message. The Houthis will almost certainly resume harassment of Red Sea shipping. That's low cost, high impact for them.
But probably not closing Hormuz.
A full closure of the Strait of Hormuz seems less probable immediately. It's perhaps too escalatory, too quickly, and hurts Iran's own economy too much right now.
Okay, so calibrated responses, not immediate all-out war. Looking a bit further out, maybe 1 to 3 months, what's the chessboard look like then?
In that 1 to 3 month window, Washington will likely ramp up pressure on the IAEA for snap inspections. Get eyes back on the ground. Tehran will probably allow some partial access enough to look cooperative while continuing repairs, especially at night ends. But critically, any clandestine centrifuge work will likely migrate to tertiary, less visible, maybe new sites.
The cat-and-mouse game continues.
Exactly, preserving assets while managing international pressure.
And then looking longer term, 6 to 12 months down the line. What about diplomacy? Could that door reopen, given all these pressures?
In that 6 to 12-month horizon, it seems plausible that a quiet, maybe EU-China facilitated channel could emerge. pushing for some kind of interim deal, perhaps a cap at 20% enrichment, plus really intrusive monitoring, something like that.
A compromise, basically.
A pragmatic compromise. Now, Israel and maybe President Trump might initially resist that kind of deal, but the costs of extended U.S. military deployment, coupled with the very real threat of an oil-led global recession, that could create enough pressure from multiple angles to reopen serious negotiations.
Economic realities forcing hands.
Economic realities and deployment fatigue could force a pragmatic shift, yes. You know, a key takeaway from all this is that while the strike may well have bought time, maybe valuable time, it hasn't fundamentally altered Iran's strategic capabilities or, crucially, its underlying motivations. The core problem isn't solved, it's just paused.
So what does this all mean for you listening? It means the situation is far more intricate than just obliterated. That word doesn't capture it. The strike truly buys time, not certainty. And Iran's response menu is broader and potentially more plausibly deniable than just all-out war. Expecting simple, predictable reactions might be a mistake here.
Ultimately, any kind of durable solution, if one is even possible, will still require diplomacy, and it likely has to go beyond a kind of zero enrichment absolutism. That position is just politically very difficult to sustain, probably in Tehran and maybe even in Washington, given the complexities we've discussed. Both sides have these entrenched positions, domestic pressures. It makes compromise hard, but maybe unavoidable.
President Trump may have smashed concrete and turbines under a mountain, but he hasn't yet answered the much harder question. How do you smash the strategic dilemma of an ideologically tenacious, technically capable Iran? And this leaves us with a provocative thought, perhaps. How do nations navigate a path back from the brink towards de-escalation when those core ideological and security concerns remain fundamentally unaddressed? And when the very act of a strike, intended to deter, might paradoxically reinforce the other side's resolve? Something to definitely consider as events continue to unfold.